Okay guys, so I want to show you the step-by-step process for setting up and creating your landscape composition. The first thing you need to do is of course do your value study for your final composition. And as far as the value study goes, it's just these small thumbnail sketches. Play around with your foreground, middle ground, and background values. Play around with the size and placement of things on there. Also, try to find good reference photos for the exact elements that you want. In this case, the reference photo at the bottom, I loved how the land was laid out, but I also like the trees in this one. Later on, I also found some clouds, and I used those as a kind of a cloud reference. But at this stage, all you're doing is playing around and getting an idea for your composition. Now, let's see, I'll keep this up. Sorry about that. Oh, come on. We'll move this over. This is my final composition and how it turned out. Couple of things to note, keep it loose and keep it painterly. I'm not looking for every single little detail. But here's how I had it all set up. First of all, when you set up your document, go to File and New, make sure it's 3000 by 2000 pixels and a good, well, resolution doesn't matter, but RGB color mode does. When you have it set up, another thing that I did was I did a detailed value study. Now you don't have to do this, not for this project at least. The reason I wanted to do a detailed study is because it would give me an opportunity to play around with some of the details and play around with some of my new brushes that I created, kind of getting a feel for how big or small they need to be when I work on my final composition. Again, keep it very quick, light, just give yourself an indication of where things need to be placed. What you do need to create for your composition is an outline of where things are. So I created a new layer at the very top. I named it Outlines. And with this one, I used just a simple brush to outline the placement of everything, where my ground plane was, where each of the objects was, where my skyline was. And if I turn this on, you can see this is what it looks like. No details whatsoever, just kind of some notations about where to paint. Later on in this video, I'm going to speed it up and just kind of do a voiceover of what I'm working through, but I do want to show you the final product and how it turned out. So here's the final painting. Notice that it's all done on the background layer. I want you to work in just one layer. This means if you make any mistakes, you got to go and paint over them. There is no erasing away from that layer. Once I was finished, however, you can tweak the colors. In this case, I used a gradient overlay, which gave me this type of effect. It really it brought out a lot of the warmer colors to work from. This was the gradient that I worked from, so my darks became a little bit more purple, my midtones became a little bit more orange, and my lighter areas got a lot more blue. As far as the color mode goes, I set it to overlay, and this is what I got. And I played around with the opacity, and I like this type of change. Another thing that I noticed, and this will go really quickly in the video, is that the background was a little bit too dark for my taste. So on top of that, I created another layer, layer 3, and I lightened up the background, giving it just a little bit more contrast and pop. Remember, you want your foreground, middle ground, and background to have a good value difference in its painting. And so that's what I'm looking for as I started off. So the next part of this particular video is just going to be sped up. I'm going to talk through my entire process, and I hope to see good work from you. So to start off this painting, you'll notice that I'm working in the background layer, and I'm putting down just a base color rather than a gray. I'm putting down a color of reds, yellows, and oranges. Next thing I'm going to do is swap to just a large brush, and I'm blocking in all of the color areas, all the main color areas. When I'm finished with this, you'll see it looks very, very cartoonish, and I really don't care about details at this time. I just want to make sure that the values of the foreground, middle ground, and background are well established. You'll also notice on there the little icons that are flashing up. For whatever reason, I had the keyboard shortcuts turned on, and so it's going to show you every time I press a key. Sorry about that. But here I am. I'm using just a large brush, blocking in the ground planes, getting an idea. I'm intentionally leaving some holes in that area. I want my background color to show through just a little bit. Since my foreground was going to be a little bit darker, especially that tree, so now I'm working with a dark, dark brown, I am picking up some colors from my original photo my reference photo that I'm working with. You'll see me move over, swap over to my eyedropper tool, and then pick up those colors. Later on, As I start feeling more comfortable with the colors that I have, I'll just kind of work very natively and pick and choose the colors from here. Now I'm moving into more of a detailed stage. I love working from the background to the foreground, that way I can paint over things easily. And I'm going to work on the clouds. You can see I'm customizing the brush a little bit more, and then I start blocking in the highlight side. Later on I'll go back and block in the shadow side of everything. Clouds are really, really easy to do. All they are is just lights and shadows, and they're in a amorphous, puffy mass. So you can be really free with the cloud. Here I am going back, putting in some midtones and some shadows. Most of the shadows on a cloud are going to have a little bit of a bluish, almost purplish tinge to them. So don't be afraid to do that. I do have a reference photo that I'm working from, so this gives me a good idea of my light direction and how the light scatters. Since I'm blocking in the colors, highlights and shadows, later on I'll go back with my smudge tool and I'll blend those together, especially around the edges. You want to get a nice soft billowy edge to it. Go back with your smudge tool. There I am with that. Now you can see it's starting to take more of a cloud-like formation. It's very difficult to overwork a cloud because you can always add a little bit more. You can push it, you can pull it back. Work within your blue families, add a little bit of red for some sunlight, and then go back in and smudge things around. There's the smudging happening. Now it looks like it's nice and faded. I still wanted this to look very painterly, so I don't care too much about getting small details. I'm not zooming all the way in. Some people love to just work at full 100% so they can see everything. In my case, I wanted to add a little bit more detail, so I zoomed in to get those particular areas. But I'm working one area at a time. Now I'm working on the background tree area. This one was most difficult because I didn't want it to seem like the sky, so I had to stay away from the blues, but I also didn't want it to seem too much like my foreground. So I had to have a good mixture between greens and blues. In this case, I think it turned out pretty well because I added highlights of green that separated it from the highlights of the blue in the sky later on. In this case, rather than starting off with the highlights, I'm actually working more towards the shadow shapes, pulling in the colors. Now when I start adding the highlights, you can really see the definition between sky and ground. Putting in some yellow, pulling in some blues for the shadows, working it back and forth. I'm not going to smudge this up as much, simply because since it's getting a little bit closer to us, we want to see a little bit more detail. We want to have more of a refined edge. You'll see that on the middle ground tree, and you'll see a lot more edge on the foreground tree. Just giving myself a little indication that there's sunlight hitting it. Once I feel comfortable with that, zoom in just onto this mid-ground area. Now I'm going to work on the trees. For these trees, make sure the ground plane can be distinguished. Give it a quick indication. You can see I'm not worried about details at all. All I'm doing is blocking in lights and darks. Later on I can go back and work with the detail. For trees, I find it more easier to block in their shadows first, then go back on top of it with highlights. I think that's because mostly trees are very dark shapes, and so you can see those dark shapes really working. Once you add the highlights, especially if you add little areas where you can see between them, then they start to pop out really well. I had the same problem with this one. I didn't want the green of the foreground to be too mixed with the green in the background, so I had to play around with how saturated was the green in the foreground. Keep in mind, things that are far away in aerial perspective, they're going to have a lot more blue to them. So I really wanted to play up those blue and purple shadows. So now I'm adding a little bit of a blue overcoat. Literally just grabbing a blue simple brush, painting it on top of there. At the end of this, you'll see me go back over this with a white. I thought the background could have been much lighter, so I just completely wash over it with a white brush. But that's looking good for there. Now I'm moving on to the main tree. Establishing my shadows, kind of establishing a tree structure. I don't want it to look too bushy, so I need to make sure you can see some limbs. What I'm doing here, since this tree is closer to me, I want to be able to see through the branches. So literally I'm having to paint some sky through those branches where you can see it. Don't want to do too much of it, but I want to give the indication that you can see through it. Then go back in, model on some foreground or some mid-tone type colors. You can see I'm working with a much larger brush so you can see the texture. I'm not going to blend this out too much. And then once I get my midtones, now I'm starting to work with some highlights, throw in a little bit of red. I don't think I really like the red, so I just painted over that. This was really fun trying to work in one layer because now I have to force myself to think exactly what I'm doing. I can't undo something quite as easy. Going over it, just making the whole thing a little bit darker, then pulling back all those highlights. Now it's starting to really show those areas where the tree is, the sky is shining through the tree. Push and pull the highlights. Break them down and reestablish it if it doesn't look good. Now I'm going back and adding a few more details to the branches on the inside. To make those branches really stand out, I had to use a very dark brush. In this case, it's almost nearly black, just a touch of brown on the inside. And now I'm using my leaf scatter brush. Set it to be really small, and just in 1 or 2 clicks, I can scatter out a couple of leaves to give me a great indication of how it looks. Here I am. Now I'm going back over the whole thing with just a whitewash, trying to lighten up that background. Once I do that, I was really satisfied because my foreground starts to pop forward. If the values are exactly the same or too close, you're not going to be able to see that foreground and background. Adding that little bit of value change really made the planes pop out. Now I can finish up working on the ground plane of my foreground. In this case, I kind of wanted it to be wrapped around with this darker shadow area and have this highlight right on the tree. It draws your eyes right to that highlighted area. Shadows don't always have to be brown or black. Make your shadows blue. Make them a little bit more purple. This way I'm sharing my colors from one area of the painting to the other. Got a special brush. This is one of those Chris Oatley brushes that allows you to paint grass very quickly. And so just in a couple of clicks, I've got a bunch of little tiny grass blades all over everywhere. As far as my composition, there it is, nice and balanced. One big on the left, many small on the right. Using that rule of thirds. Reaching close to the end now. I'm just cleaning up all the different areas, adding a few more sprigs of grass around the tree, cleaning up some highlights, making sure everything looks nice and good. From here, I'm further tweaking the colors. I'm adding a gradient overlay. In this case, the overlay was set, I think, to, ultimately to overlay, blending mode. But I'm changing up and seeing what colors work best, what blending modes work best. I drop the opacity just a little bit more. Lighten up the background. This way it gives the darks a little bit more purple tinge, and it gives the overall composition a solid